Just a reminder that this is in fact part 3 of a series I'm working on that will eventually be compiled into a larger video. So obviously, if you don't know what I'm talking about or you haven't seen them, check out the first 2 parts. They should be in a link in the description, or they will be in a playlist that you can see on my channel. Thank you for taking the time to watch.
General Orthodox Nen Training. Now that we have some of the basic and advanced techniques out of the way, we might as well circle back to the Orthodox Nen Training and go into it with more detail. Ideally, since you now know what every basic and advanced technique is, you can understand what it does and why it's learned without me having to explain each concept individually repeatedly. Again, I'm going to be focusing on what we know about standard or quote proper unquote Nen training that most people go through, as opposed to initiation. Most of the information we get on some of the more standard Nen training procedures comes from the Kakin Prince Taradnik's training, as well as some of the training Kurapika has his class perform, even if it was a bit more focused on aura control in order to prepare the class for their initiation. So Kurapika's class isn't one-to-one by his own admission, and we can't rely on everything we see within it, but plenty of it seems true and to have tangible benefits. As mentioned earlier, standard Nen training starts off with meditation exercises, as explained by Wing. In fact, when Nen is first introduced, Zushi and Wing use the idea of Nen of the Flame being just a type of meditation in chapter 46. In chapter 375, Verge's comment about Nen implies that at least some of the broader public knows that a concept called Nen exists, but they just believe it to be a mental technique that allows for abnormal amounts of strength than would otherwise be possible for the practitioner, as opposed to anything that can control aura flow or allow for the creation of objects from seemingly thin air. I bring this up because it sort of ties in with some of Nen's beginner training. While it doesn't seem to be a requirement, sometimes the martial art Shingen Ryu Kung Fu is used as a precursor to actually learning Nen. In chapter 46, Wing tries to pass off the 4 basic techniques as simply being meditation exercises, with 10 being a focus on the mind, reflecting upon the self and determining a goal, Zetsu being to put into words,
Ren being intensifying your will,
and Hatsu being to put into action. Thanks to what I discussed in previous sections, we know that this is mostly a lie because these concepts are actually referring to different techniques for controlling the flow of aura. However, the concepts of these meditation exercises have a kernel of truth to them, and by Wing's own admission in chapter 46, he didn't lie to them, and says that the Nen he told them about helps prepare the spirit.
Hello, Doug from the future. Just so you're aware that yes, I am aware that the translation on the screen, Wing is saying it helps strengthen the mind, even though I'm saying it helps strengthen the spirit. That's because the translation you're seeing on screen is a more accurate translation, although I feel like the meaning is still the same here, where Wing is saying that practicing on the flame can help strengthen your willpower and prepare your mind for Nen. So, and also just letting you know for any future reference, if there's like a very slight discrepancy in the specific terminology I'm using and the words you're seeing on the screen, that might be because I'm using a better translation now than I was before. So I just want to be transparent about that. Also, for clarity, when I say, so it was the translation I was using for the article, but I have since gone through and with the article and corrected any like major mistranslations or anything. So this video should be fine and have better translations, and that's why some of the screenshots you see in this video are different from the ones you see in the article. But the meanings should be the same. I went back and checked to clear up any mistranslations or mistaken meanings, so everything should be fine now.
In chapter 51, Wing tells Killua and Gon that while Gon was not allowed to use actual Nen, they can practice Nen of the Flame every day using these meditation principles in its place. And in chapter 52, Wing notes that Killua and Gon's control of their aura has gotten better with improved smoother Ten, despite Gon and Killua honoring their word and not using Nen for 2 months. So while some of these meditation concepts are ordinarily useless red herrings to lay people, it seems that they can produce actual results when it comes to learning how to control your aura with Nen, when applied to the proper learning process. Due to how strongly aura is linked to one's mental state and emotion, it seems like proper meditation can be used to get better at Nen without utilizing true Nen or aura manipulation. Although it's clear that this meditation isn't a permanent substitute to actually practicing real Nen with real aura. Since Wing offers to allow Killua to do Nen exercises with him and Zushi in chapter 51, after he barred Gon from using Nen for 2 months, and Gon and Killua do practice actual Nen again. When it comes to Nen, the point of starting off with the meditation exercise is to allow students to gradually become more aware of their aura flow before their nodes are open. We can assume that this way you can avoid a situation that might occur with a sudden initiation in which all your aura nodes are open, but you have no way to control your aura flow. So said aura just spills out and leaves the user exhausted. In Shingen Ryu martial art, the point of the Ten step is to help hone the mind and improve the flow of one's Ten, as we can clearly see in Gon and Killua's training under Wing. However, since Gon and Killua were initiated and Zushi was already well along the process, we get some of the more standard Nen training process later in the series. In chapter 370, Oito does a meditation exercise that involves the student closing their eyes, putting their index fingers stick slightly apart and then moving the tips of said fingers closer to each other until they feel like they are pushing against something. The point of this exercise is to gauge the student's natural talent and predisposition towards aura. The farther apart one's index fingers are from each other when they begin to feel the pushing sensation, the higher their talent for aura is and seemingly how long it will take them to learn Nen. Which, to be clear, the farther apart your fingers are when you feel the pushing sensation, the less time it will take you to learn aura. As we see Bill comment that Oito seems like the type of person who will probably take a lot of time to learn Nen after seeing how close together her index fingers are when she feels the sensation. Another exercise we see is one meant to teach the basics of aura manipulation while allowing someone to learn to feel their own aura, even if the student still doesn't have the ability to actually see it. This stage appears in chapter 366, when Theta has Tyrannic put both hands in front of his chest and imagine a ball floating in between them as a way to practice aura control. Even though Tyrannic gets the hang of this in a few moments because of his incredible talent, Theta expects him to take 3 10-minute sessions each day over the course of 10 days to get the hang of it, and she comments that if he's lucky, he'll get it in 5 to 7 days. This would imply that for most people, doing 3 10-minute exercises means it will take them 10 days to pass this part of training, while a more talented person can take 5 to 7 days. And outliers like Tyrannic can take even less time. In chapter 362, one of Prince Lazarus' guards tells him that on average it takes about 1 year for someone to gain the ability to see aura, but we know that more gifted individuals can learn Nen much faster. In chapter 368, Theta says that while the average person takes at least a year to learn Nen, it's possible for someone to learn it in half the time, so about 6 months. And in chapter 48, Zushi, who Wing states is a natural prodigy, took 6 months to learn the basics of Nen. Learning to open every single one of your aura nodes and being able to control your aura seems to take about 1 year after 3 hours of proper basic exercises every day, according to Furikov in chapter 388, after seeing Kurapika awaken one of his students to Nen. As I touched on previously, Ten seems like it's usually the first technique that is learned to keep one's aura flow from leaking away. This is done by learning to contain one's aura around them, little by little through meditations and breathing exercises, as Kurapika alludes to in chapter 388 when explaining Nen to one of his students. In chapter 56, after Gon and Kyo will get the hang of Ten, Wing seems to prioritize teaching Ren and then Gyo, an advanced form of Ren, next as a way to be able to produce enough aura to utilize more advanced techniques and perform Hatsu. But part of the reason for this could be because Gon and Killua already displayed that they knew how to use Zetsu. Gyo also seems useful for perceiving more residual aura, or aura hidden by In and such. Hatsu training, as covered earlier, seems to involve doing the water divination test over and over while attempting to produce more extreme changes in the water and or leave, which Wing has his students do in chapter 60. Kurapika also alludes to Hatsu training involving breathing exercises in chapter 388. In chapter 123, Wing tells Gon that he should practice his Ten and Ren daily because they are the foundation for more advanced techniques.
Hello, this is Duck in the Future. I just want to also clarify that part of the reason Wing tells Gon to focus on Ten and Ren so much is yes, they are fundamentals, but also because Gon is an enhancer. And enhancers have an equal balance between attack and defense. So I just thought it's important to mention that.
Nen conditions, limitations, risk, activation requirements, etc. One of the most important aspects of aura and Nen in Hunter x Hunter is that of limitations, risk, and vows. Since Nen is a product of the mind and the personality, thoughts, and mental state of someone can all influence one's aura and Nen. I would argue that the line between a condition, limitation, risk, and activation requirement can be a bit blurred, nebulous, or even kind of synonymous sometimes. But the wiki goes over them individually, so I'll break the topic up into the same categories. For the sake of the wiki and this article, a condition is basically a trade-off that makes an ability stronger, or potentially even possible in the first place. Unlike limitations and vows, it doesn't seem possible to break a condition normally. And limitation is a sort of Nen pact in the form of an additional cost or a drawback to strengthen an ability, while a vow refers to promising to uphold that pact. Activation requirements are the conditions an ability needs to meet in order to be used, and a risk is basically what it sounds like. The more of a risk you take when doing something, like leaving yourself open to an attack, or having to say a chant, the stronger the resulting Nen tends to be. When creating a Nen ability, it's possible to include conditions. Sometimes conditions are used to strengthen a technique or to compensate for a lack of skill in some area. For example, in chapter 108, Kurapika explains that he can only use his judgment chain while his eyes are scarlet. The reason for this is that the ability requires the use of omission and manipulation to maintain the chain at a distance and impose its rules. So ordinarily, Kurapika wouldn't have the force and accuracy needed to pull that off. But combining this condition with the buffs Emperor Time grants boosts the efficiency that Kurapika has when using each Nen type, but not his affinity for them, and allows him to use this ability. Conditions can be used to exceed what would normally be possible to achieve without the trade-off. In chapter 83, Izunami tells Kurapika that it's impossible to make something like an unbreakable chain with conjuration, but something quite close can be conjured with the proper conditions, limitations, and vows. Some conditions are more like active choices on the part of the user, and certain kinds of techniques actually need specific conditions to function at all. For example, in chapter 379, Fink states that spatial teleportation abilities require something called marking, meaning someone cannot use Nen to teleport somewhere they've never actually been to themselves. In Chapter 50, Wing implies that manipulating an object usually or always requires a strong connection/relationship to said object, such as Gudo controlling his tops. And even though Gudo is an enhancer, he is using manipulation in addition to enhancement on his tops. So there isn't someone who can use manipulation to go around controlling anything and everything without some sort of condition, limitation, or activation requirement, even if it's as simple as needing to touch an object or only being able to control certain things. Sherlock's experimentation with Greed Island cards and objects in Chapter 134, using the Nen abilities of Shizuku and Kortopi, seem to imply that conditions cannot be broken or ignored. This is different from limitations that can be broken but at a great cost or drawback. Despite what one may first assume, not all conditions and limitations are made via conscious choice. Earlier I mentioned how some kinds of abilities just straight up require certain conditions to even work, but sometimes conditions can manifest naturally or based on what feels right to the user. For example, Chapter 76 reveals that like any other emitter, Franklin could just fire ore projectiles out of his hand, fingers, and other such body parts. However, he cut off the tips of his fingers because he felt it would be more effective, and this self-imposed condition increased the power of his double machine gun ability. Another even more passive example of a condition can be seen in the manipulation ability Order Stamp. Despite being stolen by Crollo, it is still bound by some of the original owner's personality and sense of right and wrong, as Crollo explains in Chapter 352. While Crollo doesn't see any difference between a human corpse and an inanimate object, such as a puppet, the original owner of the ability did, and as such, Order Stamp does not work on human corpses, because they register as people instead of objects to the ability, although conjure copies of corpses count as valid inanimate targets. The original ability's creator also defined a puppet as a non-living object with a discernible head, so if something doesn't have a head, it cannot be affected by the Nen ability, and if a once eligible puppet loses its head, the ability will stop affecting it. Another common condition we see are abilities that require some sort of object or other medium to use. There's Melody and her flute for her music, Hisoka needs a thin plain surface, such as a piece of paper or napkin, as explained in Chapter 55, in order to use his texture surprise, and Lumi and his needles for the use of his manipulation, Sherlock and both his phone and antenna for black voice, etc. Sometimes it's possible to use unbreakable conditions to your advantage, because it seems like many, if not all of them, are passively active even when the user themselves is unaware of something that would otherwise break the condition of their ability. For example, Shizuku's Blinky cannot stick up living objects and or objects made with Nen, so it can be used to help detect traps or living survivors, and the vacuum seems to be bound by this condition, even if Shizuku herself is unaware that something didn't meet the ability's conditions, which Sherlock uses to his advantage when experimenting on Greed Island. Some conditions don't limit when an ability can be active, and what it targets, but rather act as a drawback, additional cost, or just extra strain on the user. For example, Kurapika says in Chapter 364 that for every second he has it per time active, 1 hour is shaved off his lifespan. Another type of restriction many abilities have is an activation requirement. This can be as simple as Lumi needing to stick at least one of his needles into someone, to having to explain your Nen ability to something much more complex. In Chapter 253, Leon reveals that the Inamura ability he's borrowed can only be used on rainy days. Some activation requirements only need to be met whenever you activate the ability. However, some need to be constantly met for the duration of the time the technique is used. For example, the Order Stamp I mentioned earlier will cancel if the thing it is controlling loses its head, despite being eligible as a puppet previously. As I touched on earlier, some activation requirements are common or needed for certain kinds of abilities to work at all. When Zeno and Silva are fighting Crollo in Chapter 98, Zeno notes that stealing abilities usually requires the one doing the stealing to meet 4 or 5 conditions, and deduces that Crollo is a specialist, once again pointing to the idea that it's a reoccurring restriction amongst people with similar abilities. Sometimes it is possible to create or find loopholes to circumvent specific Nen restrictions, or at least loosen them a little bit. For example, in order to use abilities stolen by Bandit's Secret, Crollo needs to have the book open to the page. This prevents Crollo from using certain Nen abilities that require the use of both hands, since one hand has to hold the book open, and it means Crollo can't use any abilities while the book is closed. However, in Chapter 351, Crollo reveals the bookmark ability Double Face. This ability allows him to bookmark a page and use the ability on the marked page, so he can free both his hands for an ability, or use two abilities at once if he has the book open to one page and the bookmark on another. I should make it clear that there's still definitely limits to this, since Crollo seems to have only one bookmark and cannot just use a countless number of abilities at once. Crollo also manages to find some loopholes with Order Stamp. The original user's morals prevent Crollo from just commanding the puppets to kill someone, but he can command them to break someone instead to get them to mortally wound a target. While Order Stamp cannot be used to control corpses, it can be used to control recreations/copies of corpses. The existence of loopholes like this sometimes leads to readers/watchers of the series trying to find ways to circumvent them or poke holes in the logic of this aspect of Nen. I remember seeing one comment trying to argue that Nen made no sense because you could do something along the lines of saying, actually, my ability would be a different color every time I use it, to dramatically boost its strength. But this argument is born from a massive misunderstanding of how restrictions like conditions, limitations, etc. work in Nen. First off, Nen is connected to willpower and intent, so if you purposely make a restriction that you know will not really matter or you just plan to easily circumvent without any issue, then it will be less effective. Not to mention, as pointed out in Chapter 83 by Izunami, we know vows, limitations, conditions, etc. grow stronger the more strict they are. Saying I can only use this ability every other day will yield a weaker result than saying if I use this ability at all, I will die. So, if you just plan to create a restriction where you are picking from an infinite range of colors that have slight differences in their shade, the boost would be minimal to non-existent at best, given what we know. And the same would probably be true if you said something like, I can't use this ability in space, knowing damn well you aren't planning on going to space and the chance of you just ending up there is impossible. According to Izunami in Chapter 83, the act of creating and having a rule you must abide by is known as a limitation, and the act of actually swearing to commit to said limitation is known as a vow. Unlike other conditions or activation requirements, which need to be met for the ability to even function seemingly, limitations can actually be broken at the risk of some sort of punishment, losing the capacity to use the Nen ability involved, or losing the ability to use Nen altogether. Adding additional catches, such as the loss of your life if you break a vow, can further empower a Nen ability. So you might ask, why doesn't everyone walk around making a bunch of vows to boost their Nen? Well, first, as I mentioned, the vow becomes more powerful the more conviction you have behind it, and the more of a drawback it actually is. So to make an effective vow, you need a good balance of making sure your Nen ability is actually usable for whatever its purpose is, while having a significant enough vow to actually give it the proper amount of strength it needs to get the job done. If the vow is too weak, there might just not be a point in having it, or you've just limited your ability for no reason. If the vow is too restrictive, it might hinder you more than it helps. So it's a double-edged sword that needs a careful balance. In the case of Kurapika, his chain jail can only be used on Phantom Troop members, and using it on anybody who is not currently one of the Phantom Troop members will cause Kurapika to just die. So this limitation allows for an incredibly strong chain that even Uvagen, the strongest of the spiders, an enhancer who could tank direct fire from rockets and bullets, could break out of. According to Izunami in Chapter 83, had Kurapika not also added the stipulation that using his chain jail on anyone who's not a member of the Phantom Troop would result in his death, then the ability would not have worked as Kurapika intended, due to lacking the proper strength. It's also important to remember that chain jail has a pretty hefty limitation, since at most the spiders can have like 13 members, so that's 13 safe targets out of the entire population at any given time, and that number has a chance to be less, especially if you're actively killing members of the troop. However, limitations can be weird, and they don't always guarantee that those using them can manage to get a big enough boost for the task at hand. Additionally, in Chapter 83, Izunami says that exceeding 100% of one's normal capabilities comes with risks. Going past your natural limit always comes with drawbacks, and increasing one's strength usually comes at the cost of something else that can create weak points, drawbacks, or even fatal results. So most Nen users lean towards more stable and consistent methods, and this is probably why something like Emperor Time drains Kurapika's lifespan. I would think of it like how pushing your body past its physical limits can strain it. Since Aura and Nen are tied so heavily to emotion, mental state resolve, and willpower, one's Nen strength can sometimes fluctuate in response to strong emotional states. As I mentioned earlier, self-imposed rules can actually increase the effectiveness of a Nen ability, such as the vow Kurapika made for his chain jail. And in Chapter 254, Moro addresses the possibility of Leo using his earbuds to boost the effectiveness of his ability by increasing the risk of using his ability via cutting off his sense of hearing when he does it. As mentioned earlier, in places like Chapter 83, we see determination is also an important factor with risk and conditions. Basically, you have to actually mean it and be willing to follow through with it. Trying to trick your Nen into being more powerful or something isn't going to work. Determination is also partially what made Kurapika's chain jail so powerful. In Chapter 211, Knuckle postulates that part of what makes Gon's Jajanken so strong is the added risk in taking the time to charge the attack while chanting the rock, paper, scissors, Jonken Pon, and Gon sacrificing his defensive power by focusing Aura into his fist. While risks do help boost the power of abilities, it seems like conditions or limitations can boost the power of an ability even when there's little to no risk. For example, Gon taking extra time to charge his Jajanken against Razor during the dodgeball match in Chapter 165 seems to cause a spike in Gon's aura and power, as even other characters seem caught off guard by the strength of the aura despite having already seen Gon's Jajanken rock previously. Although I guess you could argue that taking more time to charge the ability at least gives Razor more time to react and prepare as an added risk, even if Gon had all the time in the world to sit there and charge his power due to the rules of the dodgeball game.
That all being said, upon thinking about it a little bit more, I would actually assume most of the power here is coming from Gon's determination and emotion, rather than just risk.
As mentioned earlier, we've also seen intense emotion increase or influence the power of Nen. An example of this would be when Morel asked Gon to attack him in Chapter 223. Thinking about Kite's death and mutilated corpse leads to Gon having a massive influx of aura, and Gon apologizes before admitting that he really was determined to kill Morel in that moment, which is something that also could have influenced the attack's power.
So basically, an activation requirement are the conditions you need to meet in order to even use an ability in the first place, while a condition is basically what an ability can and can't do. A limitation and a vow are added stipulations added onto an ability to increase their power, force, accuracy, etc. And a risk is just how much of a risk you're taking when using an ability or performing a certain action. Conditions seem like they cannot be broken, while limitations and vows can be broken by some sort of cost or drawback. And of course, an activation requirement is what you need to meet in order to use an ability in the first place. So obviously, if you don't meet the activation requirement, you can't use the ability in question. In order to help visually conceptualize how restrictions really work in Nen, I think of it all like a water and hose. The Nen is water flowing through a hose, and by tightening the nozzle or the hose itself, you're restricting water flow. But in return, the water exits the hose with more force and accuracy thanks to the increased pressure. However, the water spray covers less area and requires more accuracy. This is just a metaphor I use, not one used in the series, but I think it's apt because ore is likened to steam, a form of water that can also become more intense when put under pressure. Okay, this is Doug from the future again. I'm not sure I did the best job explaining the restrictions on Nen, because Finks does refer to marking as a kind of activation requirement. So I just also want to once again circle back to the fact that if you ask me, the exact line between a condition and limitation, activation requirement, etc., can be kind of blurred and nebulous sometimes. And activation requirement is a kind of condition, is a type of condition within this more simplified framework that I've been using, which I think I should have probably done a better job explaining that.